Welcome to the 2020 Bronx Book Festival. I'm so happy to have you here for All I Need Is One Mic. First off, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Sara Gonzales. Sara Gonzales is a Bushwick native and publicist from Mundos Bookstore. She's an avid reader, writer, and supporter of emerging Latinx authors. Sara has attended many writing workshops, including Bona, Quayle Journal Fiction, Catapult Flash Fiction, Writing Our Lives, Writing from the Womb, and the Sankofa Writers Weekend Retreat. Sara is also a dedicated literary citizen. She's a member and volunteer for the Center for Fiction, and she's on the planning committee for the Bronx Book Festival 2020. Her most important role is as a kick-ass black belt mama to X-Man. Sara, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to showcase these three brilliant authors that I follow and I'm obsessed with. So thank you for the opportunity. I want to introduce our panel today for All I Need Is One Mic. Roya Marsh is a Bronx native, is a nationally recognized poet, performer, educator, activist. She is the poet in residence at Urban Word, New York City, and works feverishly towards LGBTQIA justice and dismantling white supremacy. Marsh's work has been featured in Poetry, Flypaper Magazine, Frontier Poetry, Village Voice, Nylon, The Huffington Post, Button Poetry, Def Jam's All Def Digital, Lexus Verses and Flow, NBC, BET, and the Breakbeats Poets, Volume 2, Black Girl Magic. Welcome, Roya.
Yeah.
Next, I'd like to introduce Andrés Cerpa. He's the author of Bicycle in a Ransacked City, an Elegy 2019, and The Vault, due out in 2021 from Alice James Books. He is a recipient of fellowships from the MacDowell Colony and Cantamundo. His poetry and prose has appeared or is forthcoming in Plowshares, Poem a Day, the Kenyan Review, the Breakbeat Poets Volume 4, Puerto Rico en mi Corazón, Boricua en la Luna, The Offing, The Rumpus, Frontier Poetry, West Branch, and elsewhere. Welcome, Andrés.
Thank you.
And finally with us is Vanessa Mártir. Vanessa Mártir's work has been widely published, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Long Reads, The Rumpus, Bitch Magazine, the Vona Voices Anthology, Dismantle, and the New York Times bestseller, Not That Bad, edited by Roxane Gay. A 5-time Vona Voices and 2-time Tin House Fellow, Vanessa is the recipient of a 2019 Bronx Recognizes Its Own Brio Award in Creative Nonfiction. She's also a 2019 AWP Kurt Brown Award in Creative Nonfiction and a 2013 Jerome Foundation Award for T&W Artist. She is the creator of Writing Our Lives Workshop and the Writing the Mother Wound movement, both of which facilitates across the country and online. Vanessa is dedicated to helping LGBTQ, non-binary, and writers of color get their work out in the world, and has partnered with Tin House and the Rumpus to do so. She is currently partnering with Long Reads to publish Mother Wound essays. Vanessa has also served as a guest editor of Asterix and the James Franco Review. When she's not writing or teaching, you can find Vanessa either on a dance floor, in a gym punching a bag, or in a forest somewhere, hugging trees and talking to birds. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you.
How are we all doing?
Good.
Good. All right, I'm excited for this. So, I have a couple of questions. We'll talk about your writing, craft, your inspiration, your community. I'm definitely coming at you as a writer. So some of these questions are definitely craft related. My first question is, what do you think is your mic, your voice in writing? So we'll start with Roya.
Awesome. I think I would have to say my mic is definitely what I highlighted in my bio, which is being a voice specifically for the youth that are in the LGBTQIA+ community, as well as young people of color. I'm a Bronx native, born and raised, and it's been a gift for me to be able to travel the world, but also bring back everything that I've learned to the Bronx. which I do have a growth program in the Bronx that is free, and it services youth from ages 12 to 24. And it's just a phenomenal experience to be able to see these young women growing, and me passing my microphone onto them for them to share whatever it is, whatever tale it is that they want to tell with the world.
Yeah.
Fantastic. How about you, Vanessa?
I'm from Bushwick, Brooklyn, all day, but not present day Bushwick, right? Bushwick when it was a pile of rubble, you know, a place that nobody went to. Before there were $15 burger bars and a trash can on every corner, you know, during the crack epidemic. I'm from somewhere that they told me directly and indirectly that our stories didn't matter. So my mic is definitely a pushback on that, saying actually our stories do matter, and we need to write them, and our voices matter, and not the voice that we've been told to write in, right? Not white, not dead, not male, queer as F. I'm not sure if I can. I should have asked that if I can curse. I'm a truck driver with my language, you know that, Sarah. But queer and brown and Black and poor and working class and immigrant and second generation and all of those stories that are not in the canon, right? The quote unquote canon. So it's about deconstructing the canon, just throwing it out and creating our own. It's why I created Writing Our Lives, to help people like me who grew up where I grew up, you know, or in similar situations, were marginalized, and to help them write their stories. My love genre is creative nonfiction. I mean, I've written fiction, I've written poetry, but there's something about creative nonfiction, memoir, and personal essay that just has a hold of my heart, because I think that we can affect change through telling our stories, real life stories. So that's my mic. And I agree with Roya, you know, passing that mic on to young writers, even established writers, emerging writers, you know, folks who have been told, you know, your stories don't matter. They do. And that's the work that I do in the world. Absolutely. Great question, by the way.
Thank you. Andrés, what do you think your mic and your voice is in your writing?
I think that in part, like, the microphone is about projection. So like in publishing a book, I don't know who's reading my work, but I sort of like have to trust that it's reaching somewhere, right? And even if like I can't physically see or interact with someone who's like impacted by the work, that I need to sort of insert myself and have a book that like ends up in the Library of Congress, right? Or ends up on a syllabus, that's sort of like my microphone, so that someone can resonate with that and hopefully have like deeper access to their own humanity and see that maybe what, you know, the run-of-the-mill poetry sort of like curriculum that's out there can be more than that. And maybe they can use some of those things and turn it into what they see in the world. So my microphone is, I don't know who's on the other end. I have a microphone in a very dark room. Yeah.
That's cool. Thank you for that. My next question is, how much does place present itself in your writing? We see the Bronx, we see Brooklyn, we see parts of Staten Island. How did it shape your work? Starting with Roya.
All right. I would say the Bronx has a great deal with the shaping of my work, simply because it wasn't only the place that I came to be, but it was also the place that I like grew up into who I was going to be forever, right? And I do think that as humans, we are ever changing, especially because the folks in this profession are learning, broadening our lexicons, and just taking in more and more information as we continue to read and to grow. But for me, I started out freestyling, like people were beating on the lunchroom table, right? That was in the Bronx, right? Then my history of hip hop, right, is the Bronx being its birthplace, right? I'm the youngest of 8 children, so I grew up listening to my siblings playing Grandmaster Flash, right, and the Furious Five. So like, I'm then even my mom's like connection to like Motown. So being so musically inclined, but then having these brothers who were like exemplifying all of the magical things the world had to offer and listening to Onyx. So it was like, oh, all right, rap is the way to go. And that's the way that I began and journeyed. I went to school in the Bronx for my entire life until I left for undergrad. And moving past that, I think the most transformative experiences that I had happened there. So when I'm writing a biographical book of poems, right, I'm thinking about the setting. I'm thinking about where this happened. I'm thinking about the first kiss I had at the flagpole in Parkchester in the Bronx, right? I'm thinking about who said something disrespectful, like who called me, you know, a name, and where it was happening. And it happened at the lunch table, which was in the lunchroom of St. Raymond's Elementary in the Bronx, right? So there is literally no way for me to escape that setting. But what I could do with the magic of writing and narrative is broaden it, right? And expand it and consider what that lunchroom turned into, right? Did it turn into a jungle when he said that? Was I a leopard ready to pounce, right? What happens in those moments? And also, I think most importantly, I was a street kid. So like, when I think about my journey, when I think about fashion, when I think about anything, it's streetwear, it's basketball at the playground, right? A pickup, like it's all happening outdoors, outside. So it all comes back to me, you know, in that way.
Vanessa?
Oh, wow. Places. I actually left Bushwick at 13 and never moved back. I went to boarding school. I went from Bushwick, Brooklyn in 1989. I'm older than I look, y'all. In 1989 to Wellesley, Massachusetts. Boarding school, right? And that saved me in many ways, but it also messed me up. I grew into my racial consciousness because Bushwick was brown and Black. And while there were racial tensions, the pervasive issue was poverty. So I didn't, you know, I went away to boarding school to a very white, very rich town. And I had to deal with not fitting in, going from somewhere where everyone was like me to somewhere where no one was like me. And then I came running back to New York for college. And I have not left, but place is everything. And I go, because in my work, I always go back to Bushwick. I mean, I went to Columbia University where I was told again, I still remember my first creative writing class. The professor told me, write about something beautiful from your childhood. I actually just had an essay published that's telling this story. And I wrote about Teresa, the neighborhood quote unquote crackhead. It's a horrible term, but that's what I'm using, the colloquial term that we used, right? And I wrote about her because she was beautiful when she was high, because she was happy. Because when she was sober, she was so sad and she could be so mean. And I remember that professor gave me, when he returned the piece, he said, this isn't writing. And he didn't have the cojones to look at me when he said it. So what he was telling me was what the world told me left and right, that our stories don't matter and that my people are not worthy of being written about. So I had to unlearn that. But I unlearned that by going back to Bushwick in my stories and in my heart, right? And always centering my stories around like the beauty of these people who lived in rubble, right? During the crack epidemic, when the government just left us there to rot, and somehow a people that were so resilient, not only did we survive in that, we often thrived in it, we kept going. You know, so places, I mean, I center Bushwick, I center also the forest, Inwood Hill Park. I lived in Inwood for many years. Now I'm in Riverdale. There's parks all over the place. Like if you know me and my work, like nature is everything. So also nature and gardening and the like. But again, it's always going back to this voice and these stories that take my power back, that say, actually, we are beautiful. Actually, we are worthy of being written about. And I can do that by writing about place and using it often as a metaphor. Yeah.
Okay.
Andrés?
That's wonderful. Yeah, I grew up on Staten Island. My dad is from the Bronx. He was born in Puerto Rico, and then like 3 months later, they were in the Bronx. And and my abuela lived there, Grand Concourse on 164th. My dad grew up in Fort Apache, worked at Job Corps. So a lot of my book is about my relationship with my dad. And one of the interesting things about him is, I mean, horrible, traumatic things happened to him in the Bronx throughout his life. But he loved that place. Like also the best, most, you know, sort of like precious moments, the moments that, you know, even when he was dying, he was thinking back on is like those gems and those jewels of those moments and like what his youth looked like and how exciting it was. And like riding a bicycle with a bunch of his friends, like, and feeling like they were not in the city because they were, you know, riding for 50 miles all the way around New York City is something that he like sort of treasured. And I think that Charles Wright, who's a poet, I don't know, from like Virginia, said all landscape is autobiography out of a poem. And I think that when I like talk to my dad or I'd visit my abuela or we'd like walk around, all of those stories all had places in them, right? So that his autobiography became so much a part of the place. And then my sort of relationship with place is I have a deep relationship with the Bronx, but I also have a deep relationship with Staten Island and the idea that, oh, you have to move on. Like, oh, you're in Puerto Rico. There's not enough opportunity. Okay, we're going to move to New York. All right, now we got a little bit set up. Now we're going to move and we're going to move and we're going to move. So that's a part of the diaspora that they were constantly sort of like on that move, but finding sort of that real sort of like root is my relationship to place, I think.
Yeah. I want to add something, if I may. I think also like this nostalgia. I think nostalgia is often like it's odd because I don't have another word right now, but it's like often for me at least, a longing for something that wasn't always, that was gritty and hard. And sometimes it was traumatic, but it was always home. Right? Like you could always go back and it's always home. Even now I go to Bushwick and, you know, I have to walk far from the organic markets and far from the yoga studios, but you'll find these little niches that are like, you know, the borinqueña is hanging across the, you know, the avenue. And you hear the salsa, like from somebody's window, you hear freestyle or some Grandmaster Flash, old school. Right. And I go in my mind back to when they used to wear the MCM suits, right? Or the velour suits and the cardboard on the floor and the big jumbo boombox, and they're using the electricity from the lamps, from the poles, right? The light poles, and they're dancing, and we're all experiencing joy in spite of all the struggle that's going on around us, you know? And there's something beautiful in that, incredibly beautiful and worthy of being written about and, you know, chronicled.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's beautiful. My question, so one thing that I picked up in all your writing, there's this element of like symbolism, or, you know, what they say motifs. And for me, what stood out for the three of you was the bike for Andrés, the plum tree for Vanessa, and for Roya, the letter G. And I wanted you to speak to that because that's what stood out as a reader, and they sort of took a life on its own. So we'll start out with Roya, the letter G.
Awesome. Definitely, as it is seen here in the title of my book, it's the only letter that is capitalized. In the beginning of the book, I actually had the honor of dedicating the following pages to the three women who raised me, which are my grandmother, my mother, and my aunt. And all three of their names begin with G. And in thinking and growing into a writer, into a woman, it is like I would be lost if I didn't say that those were the people who taught me how to be a woman, a Black woman in America in general, not just in the Bronx, not in New York, but in the world, right? And I think what's extremely important for me was to be able to have them travel with me as the book traveled. And in writing, none of the poems had titles, right? And I usually do this thing where like I'll take the first line of the poem and then lead the rest of the poem and have that first line be the title. But for this project, that just didn't sit right with me necessarily. And then going through the pages over and over, the book was titled. That was always the title, but the significance of that capital G didn't exist yet until I actually was like just reading through it this one day. And I was like, oh, all right, here's how we're gonna go about this, right? And I started creating for a few of them. And like, when I got to like maybe the 7th poem, the words actually just started flowing, right? It's like, this poem is about me having the gall, right, to exist in this world, in this body. This next poem is about the loss of a sibling to a gun, so gunshot, right? The next poem, and then in reading the actual titles themselves, like they also read as a poem, just from the table of contents. And I think there was a message in that for me that I also didn't intend, right? And so even finding that, it made it seem so serendipitous, right? To be in that moment where I was like I created a thing that even I bang with, right? like as opposed to just hearing, you know, the editors like, yo, this is beautiful, this is great, what are we gonna call it? And I'm like, a book? I don't really. But also considering the way that those women held me and nurtured me, and the fact that no matter where this book ends up in the world, they're still right here with me, is the most incredible and the most meaningful part of this project as a whole, right?
That's dope. That's incredible. Yeah. So the plum tree is where I became a writer. I lived on the first floor. My mother still lives in the same apartment. So we had a backyard. And I now understand what my mother did. My mother was creating an oasis for herself in a war zone. Because Bushwick back then, I mean, I remember being 6 and 7 years old and seeing images of Beirut, right? After the bombings, and thinking like, this looks like Bushwick. This looks like home. And like as a little kid making that connection. So my mother had this beautiful garden. And we had a plum tree, and I was, you know, the tomboy, right? I learned how to climb that tree, and it was in that tree that I became a writer, because I started telling myself stories in the tree and also in the junkyard next door, right? Because there were Bushwick was dotted with those like rubble-strewn lots, and one of them was right next door. So I used to climb when my mother wasn't looking. I used to climb the fence. Well, it was dilapidated, so it wasn't difficult to climb over. And now in hindsight, like now that I have a kid, I'm like, oh my God, like that was dangerous. I remember seeing like syringes and like all sorts of, but I would go in there and I would imagine, like this was back in the Indiana Jones days. I am totally aging myself, but that's all right. So I used to imagine myself as like the female Indiana Jones, you know? And also being very clear, like aware that I wasn't white. Like, even though I didn't fully grow into my racial consciousness until later, like it was like, oh, I'm like Latina, Honduran, and Puerto Rican, like, you know, saving the world. So that was when I really started, like in the plum tree and in that junkyard was when I started like telling myself stories and watching my mother and like imagining a different life, a life where I felt loved by her, you know? But I also experienced a lot of trauma in that yard too. So I think writing about the plum tree also was a way of taking back the beauty of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrés, your bike.
It's kind of interesting that you say like building an oasis, because that's how I sort of feel about the bicycle.
Yeah.
As a kid, I mean, I would be able to ride bike. I would live in Staten Island, and I could ride bike, and I would ride bike with my dad because he was pretty serious about cycling. But like, he developed that seriousness about cycling when he bought his own bike, you know, like 12 after working in a furniture store. And when I think about the bicycle itself, like, it's a way to leave without leaving. You know, you can have this whole city turn into a blur around you. You can have sort of like your youth and autonomy for whatever the hour, 2 hours, 3 hours that you're just riding, right? You have an excuse, you have a place to be, the wind is on you. and you have some sort of like freedom before you return. So I think that also some of the things that are happening in my book are sort of like seasonal, and there's some sort of like circular motion happening there. And I think that that circular motion is about that idea of like the wheel, the season turning, and maybe it's turning too fast, but also building that space where I can leave without leaving, you know, and creating that space that's necessary to, you know, survive or live.
Thank you. I just want to say my biggest mission in life as a bookstore, as a reader, and an emerging writer is I want to see myself in books. I want kids to come into that bookstore and see their reflection being sent back. One of the things that we done as a bookstore was go to the local high school, and I had all the POC book covers on that desk. And I said, what do you see? And they all responded, they see themselves. So my next question to you, so much of your writing talks about identity. I'm curious to see, who do you want to feel seen when they read your work? Who do you want your audiences to be? Starting with Roya.
Awesome question. I start like I don't know what it's called. In my mind, it's like pinwheel, but it's not a pinwheel. But you know, like when someone's trying to hypnotize you and they make you like stare at that dot, and then when it spins, like you start seeing all these swirls. Well, the dot is like Black queer youth, right? And like all of those swirls are the people around them. You know, when I think personally about what drove me to the sort of poetry that I'm doing now, or even my like pedagogical practices, right? I'm thinking about what I needed when I was that age. When I get on stage or when I'm selecting a poem to read for a feature or whatever, I'm thinking about what I need in that moment and how best I can convey that to the group in front of me, right? So I think for me, my center has always been like Black queer youth. And then beyond that, all the communities that are adjacent to them that need to know how to live with these people, right? How to treat them, how to hold them, how to make room and make space for them to exist, to feel safe, to feel free, to feel normal, right? The book that I created, Daylight, was literally born of a thesis project that was about Black butch visibility and how I grew up very rarely seeing anyone, right, who looked like me, who presented in the world like I did, sans Queen Latifah in Set It Off when I was like 6 years old and should have never been watching that movie. Right? And 2 decades later in Lena Waithe on Master of None, you know? So it's like there are these times in between where, you know, like Laura Winslow went through a phase where she wore like baggy clothes, but like she wasn't a lesbian, you know, like, and I knew that as a child. Like I could look at her or any character in the world and be like, wow, they are beautiful. I have a crush on them. But no, in my mind, they would never be, they're not like me. You know, that was the thought that I had when I was a child. And much like you said, you lay those book covers out when you go to those high schools, you know, I also didn't see that. Even all the way up to all of the master's programs that I've been in. Like, even when they're teaching philosophers and writers of color, they're from 100 years ago. And it's like, there are people who are doing this work right now, right? And that's what I want people who are reading our work to see, right? So when I'm suggesting my contemporaries, my peers, or artists that I revere, I want people to know, yo, there's an address in Bushwick that you might be able to drive by one day and just scream out, I love you, so that someone can hear it, right? You might be able to go to Staten Island right quickly and be like, oh my gosh, yo, I read this book and it was amazing. Let me cycle past where this person might have been talking about, or see a plum tree, or end up in Mundos, right? And know that all of these artists at some point have some sort of spirit or some sort of energy there. And I think for me, like, a lot of, in like, just to close out, like a lot of people are like, oh, you know, you don't, like write for white people, or I get a message like, hey, I'm a white woman and I just wanted you to know, even though the book wasn't for me, I love, and it's like, no, reading is for everyone. Everyone who can read should be reading. And folks who can't read, guess what? I'm on Audible. So like, I'm being truthful, like I tried to make it as accessible as possible. And that's including the language, that's including where it's being promoted, you know? And for me, like, I want everyone to have a piece of this, but the folks who I want to see themselves are the folks who don't see themselves anywhere.
Right. So I say in no uncertain terms, I don't write for white people. Like, you know, I always think of, you know, Toni Morrison in that famous interview where she's like, I don't write for white people. I mean, it's great if they read it, but the people who I want to see themselves, like I think about my daughter, she's 15 years old, you know, I think about, like, I write specifically for Loba Pack. That's what I call them, Loba Pack. These are my crew, my people with whom I can be my complete, full, authentic, relentless self. I can be Vanessa, you know. I dance when I talk. I talk a lot with my hands. I go from English to Spanish. I can get real hood, and I can get wild intellectual. Like I can be all these many layers of who I am, right? I am queer. I'm also writing for the girl who was raised by butches. I was raised by a butch in 1970s and 1980s New York City. Homosexuality was on the list of mental disorders until 1973, like a few years after that, you know. So I want those kind of people. I'm writing for them. I want that young girl who goes away to boarding school to get a better education. And she's just spoon-fed all of these like white male writers, you know, and she might get like 2 writers of color, right? So she's being told by the world that her history and her people are not worthy of being studied, right? I want her to see herself in my work. I want that young person who goes to an Ivy League and puts himself into debt because we're told that that's what we're supposed to do, right? To see themselves in these stories about being a student at Columbia University and, you know, during the ethnic studies fight, taking over Hamilton Hall, like people getting arrested, the hunger strikes, like that fight that we had in us to get ethnic studies, which we finally got in our senior year, having to take 23 credits my last semester so that I could complete could complete the major. Right? Like, that's wild that I had to do that. But in order to get that major, to complete the major that I fought for, you know, I want that young woman to see herself, that queer bisexual girl who's dealt with biphobia, right? Who comes into her queerness later on because she's finally able, even though I grew up raised, even though I was raised in a lesbian relationship, my mother had a lot of shame with it. So she put me in a Jehovah's Witnesses Bible study classes when I was in junior high. So that made me kind of, you know, and now when her partner died, my mother went back to being a Jehovah's Witness. So this is my life. So that kind of like complicated, layered narrative that exists, because I know it. So I'm also writing for that young woman, you know, and for my brother who passed away, my Superman, who passed away 7 years ago in a few weeks. I write for him too. I see him in my work. Actually, my book, A Dim Capacity for Wings, a memoir, which I'm working on, and I'm writing it to him also for him. That's who I'm writing for. Because he was the one person who said, I mean, when we found out he was going to pass away, I was on my way to Vona. And I was going to cancel the trip. And you know what he told me? You have to go write our stories, sis. He died 3 days later. So I also write for him, you know. But yeah, I don't write for white people, and I'm really unapologetic about that. I do want to end with that.
Andrés, who's your audience?
I think that I've been most surprised, or one of the most like wonderful interactions that I've had like since, you know, like publishing a book, is that I had a home health aide who's just like, you know, just come up to me and say like, oh, I sort of resonate with this and I understand about how when people are really sick and they sort of like enter dementia and Parkinson's, how they keep repeating themselves, right? So someone who's working with someone that's a family member, but basically has a hard, is giving all they have to help keep someone that they don't really know alive. And her reading that book and saying that she like could understand a little bit more or be able to like enter the psyche of some of the people that she was working with is like super important to me and sort of like an unexpected audience. I've also like talked to nurses. I work at the College of Staten Island and they have like a big nursing program. So that was sort of like an interesting audience that I didn't think I was writing for that has sort of like emerged. And in terms of the idea of audience, I mean, I'm pretty like reserved and shut down and muffled about emotions. And I think that I did it for me, in all honesty, with the faith that I knew that someone out there is going to resonate with these things that are happening. I mean, how many people, you know, millions of people had their parents living in their homes dying of degenerative diseases. There's plenty of teenagers that have their grandparents sitting at home. Abuela is sitting at home and she's losing it. And it's painful and it's difficult to acknowledge and it's difficult to deal with on a daily basis. So I'm thinking about those individuals who are living in close proximity or working in close proximity and just touching the people that are slowly sort of like dying in front of them. That's who I hope might encounter this book. Yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you. Well, time has flown by and I've been asked to ask some social media questions. So I'll start out with you, Andrés. Your favorite poet of all time. You can only name one.
Oh man. My favorite poet is Larry Levis. He's a poet out of Fresno. He died in 1996. And he's my favorite poet just because he makes me want to write better. You know what I mean? When I say like, I don't necessarily have like competition, not that I'm saying I'm better. I don't think it's like healthy to compete between living poets. So I'm always trying to compete with the dead in a certain sense. And Larry Levis is my bar.
That's great.
The next question is for Roya. Someone is a very big fan of yours. They want to know, what is your philosophy of style?
You know, I believe that I know who asked that question. Also, I'm very curious if they're referring to the way that I dress or if they're asking about my writing style. So I will answer that in two parts. My philosophy of style, in terms of the way that I dress, is where I feel most comfortable based on any given day, any given mood. My philosophy of style, depending on how I write, is where I feel most uncomfortable. I began writing 100% as a place of solace, right? It was an escape for me away from everything that was happening in the world, but I was actually writing about all of the things that were happening in my world. And now I am in this space where I realize that I do live in a world where a lot of the things that are happening to me are happening to so many other people, right? So I want to tell my story with a very close lens on harm reduction, but also being truthful and being honest and incorporating all of the ways in which the world has done me dirty and done me amazingly well, right? Yeah, that's what I got for style.
Thank you. In writing about rape culture, which can be very triggering, I'm wondering, how did you, Roya and Vanessa, tackle writing about these topics in your poems and essays? Let's start with Vanessa.
So I want to say the first thing that I need to say, the essay that was published in Not That Bad took me 7 years to write. Okay, so I did it little by little, day by day. I don't know a way to do it quickly. I remember when Roxane first put out the call, like I've been working on this essay. I mean, I workshopped it at Vona back in 2011 with Stacey Ann Chin, you know, like I have been working on this essay. Like at one point it was 20 pages, at one point it was 3, and then it like, you know, revision, because writing is revision. And I remember when Roxane Gay first put out the call, I knew what essay, and it wasn't called what it is now called in What I Told Myself. It had various titles, but I wasn't ready. And then she put out a second call, and she was very clear. She's like, I need 2 to 3 essays by women of color. And she got shit for that, right? Because people were like, oh, you know, Karens were mad. They were big mad. And I remember just coming to my computer and opening up the essay. And what I realized was I finally knew what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. And I finished revising that essay in like 5 hours. But it took me 7 years to write the essay, right? And when I finished it, I sent it off. And I remember I first got a rejection. 2 minutes later, she wrote back and was like, that was a mistake. We're still considering your piece. But I didn't see the second email. So at that point, I was so ready that I had already written a list of places that I was going to submit this essay, right? Because I read it again and I was like, no, it's ready. And my wife, she was my partner then, she's now my wife, called me and was like, well, what did it say? Like, what did she say? And I went back into the email, and that's when I saw that she was like, it's my honor to accept your work. And I was like, you know, but it took me 7 years. So the only thing, it's like little by little, day by day. You know, there's no quick way to do it. And you have to take care of yourself when you're doing this work. You have to take care of yourself when you're doing this work, because you can easily re-traumatize yourself. You know, yeah, that's what I got.
Thank you. Roya?
Yeah, I will say for me, it's very evident where I go when I am considering discussing this topic, and it's church. And I think in my poetry, it manifests that way almost every time, because that's where I went in real life. Right, I was like, "Oh shit!" The only place that I can go is to God, right? So, one of the more popular poems that I've written that I can't perform anymore, because when I first began to perform it, it was extremely helpful, and then I couldn't do it without breaking down crying. But it's called The 7 Sacraments, right, of coming to peace with my molester, and then like moving forward. There's a piece in Daylight where I'm consistently quoting the Bible, using the scripture to actually dispel all of the myths that I was told about God and familial relationships, and like, look at all the things that were happening to me, especially with people who are heavily involved in the church, right? Who are still being incredibly predatory and harmful in the world. And I think about how I might best help someone. And that's, for me, the way that I can truthfully and honestly tell the story. And the way in which I tackle writing about it, sometimes I can just do it. Other times I'm like, okay, here is this thing that I'm trying to create. Here is this tale that I'm trying to tell. And I think about the list, like I make a list of, coping mechanisms for myself. I make a list of details that I think need to be in the piece. And then of course there'll be some like throwaway things like, well, I don't have to say I was wearing a red shirt, right? That doesn't matter here. But I'll just like map it out. And then I also like really meditate and ask myself if I can. And there have been periods where, not 7 years, but definitely like very lengthy periods where I'll sit back down at my desk and I'm like, not today, Satan. And I just keep on moving, you know? And also just constantly reminding myself that this is for me and for us who have existed and who are surviving and want to grow towards thriving, right? As opposed to like writing to that person. And also letting myself know that I don't have to be a hero, that I didn't have to save myself, that there are a community of people who are trying to lift me through this process.
Right.
Thank you for that. This is a question for Andrés. What does a beginning writer need to know about getting published? One thing I've learned through the bookstore, there's not a single trajectory for people to get published, and poetry is a whole other ballgame. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
I think that publishing, you know a lot about a piece when you hit the submit button. And I feel like I am extremely resilient in terms of rejection because I know I put in the work. Right now, you send it to a magazine, somebody has a bad day, you didn't research the magazine well enough, they probably don't like your stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that we think sometimes, like, beginning new writers think about publication as sort of like being like, oh, I'm finally accepted, right? There is a huge amount of acceptance that's important to like keep you going, right? But I think that if you know you're doing the work, part of your work is to keep submitting. That's a different type of brain than the creative stuff. And I have like my shark brain that just like goes and I say like, I'm going to submit to every single magazine that I would want to be published in. When I get my rejection, I'm sending it again. And saying like that diligence, the same diligence that you bring to the work is the same diligence that you need to do in finding sort of a publisher and someone who respects your writing and wants to put it out there and pay you for it and do you decent, right? You want to find someone that likes your work and will give you an audience, right, to help somebody else. It's hard though. I've gone through my submittable, and for the past like 6 years, I get rejected every other week by a magazine that I really wanted to be in. And if you throw enough shit against the wall, something's going to stick. But you just got to make sure you're doing the work. And I think that's the thing that helps me deal with the rejection.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's honesty and transparency right there. All right, so this is the last question and it's up for grabs. The last one for the social media that came in. How do you decide what to read in public?
I learned how to read my work from poets. Like, poets are the ones that taught me how to, like, intonation, like, that poets gave me permission to be my full self while I am reading. Not everyone can read, though, their prose. I've learned that. There are people who are fantastic writers, and they get on a mic, and you're just like, oh my God. Like, and it doesn't take away from, like, their work, but they're, but I think going to New Yorican and being an avid, I love poets. Like, I hang out with poets. I don't really hang out with prose writers. Like, and they taught me that I can read anything, right? If I feel it in my body, I can read it. So thank you, poets.
I choose, more recent. So I started this particular project with an essay, and twice now I've like read an excerpt from that essay, and it's felt so beautiful because it was a place where I could exercise what I was doing before I was writing poems, right? Which was figuring out how to slip poetic language into these essays and like have the teachers be like, huh, intriguing or whatever, right? But now, unless someone has asked for something specifically, I do what's on my heart. And people are going to receive it. I'm in charge of my intention and my delivery. So people are going to receive whatever it is. And I'm going to take my check.
Yeah. Right.
I like to build sort of like a small like narrative trajectory or a thematic trajectory inside of my reading. And that sort of makes it fun for me in the way that like I'm reorganizing the things that I've written and help myself like learn something about them, and to say like, oh, we're going to go on a little journey together. Even if that's something that's like very subtextual, it's something that drives me forward and like helps me focus on like what notes I really want to hit.
And thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm trying not to fangirl too much here. It's my first moderation of an event. I attend so many in New York, but the Bronx Book Festival is my heart. A lot of work goes into this. There's a lot of folks that are behind the scenes, but thank you for the honor and the privilege of spending time and the space that you've given to this new virtual world that we're in today. And I wish you all the best. I wish you, your families and your loved ones are healthy and safe. And go out and buy their books. I'm telling you, this flew by. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you,
You all.
Roya and Andrés. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
This was beautiful. I can't wait to see it.
yeah, for real.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.